There's a number most people never hear about, and it's strange because it might be the single most important number in your entire financial life. Not your salary, not your net worth, not even your credit score. It's the number where your money starts making more money than you do, where the growth in your accounts in a given year starts to outpace what you're actually putting in yourself. Most people assume this moment, if it ever comes, happens near the end, somewhere close to retirement, after decades of contributions have piled up. And for most people, that's roughly true if they're not paying attention. But here's what almost nobody explains. This moment can happen far earlier than people expect. Sometimes 10 or 15 years earlier, depending on a handful of specific decisions. And when it does happen, it changes something psychological, not just financial. It's the point where saving money starts to feel less like sacrifice and more like just watching something you already built keep building itself. I want to spend the next 15 minutes walking you through exactly what this number is, why almost nobody talks about it, the specific math behind when it actually arrives, and, this is the important part, the handful of decisions that either pull this moment years closer or push it years further away without you ever realizing it's happening. Let's get specific, because the number where your money starts working sounds vague until you see the actual mechanics underneath it. Every dollar you have invested is doing two jobs at once. It's sitting there as principal, the actual amount you put in, and it's generating returns, growth that gets added on top, which then itself starts generating its own returns the following year. That second part, growth generating growth, is compounding, and everyone's heard the word. What almost nobody walks through is the specific moment where that second job starts outperforming the first one. Here's a simple way to picture it. In the early years of investing, your own contributions are doing almost all the heavy lifting. If you're putting in $500 a month and your portfolio grew by, say, $400 last year from market returns, your own contributions are still the dominant force building your account. You are, in a very real sense, still the engine. But portfolios don't grow linearly. They grow on a curve because each year's growth compounds on top of the previous year's growth, not just on top of your contributions. At some point, and this is the number I'm talking about, the dollar amount your portfolio grows by in a single year, purely from market returns, becomes larger than the dollar amount you're contributing yourself. That's the crossover. That's the moment the engine quietly changes from you to your money. For a lot of people contributing consistently at reasonable market returns, this crossover tends to happen somewhere in the range of 8 to 15 years into serious, consistent investing, sometimes sooner, depending on contribution rate and market conditions. Which means for someone who started in their late 20s or early 30s, this moment can realistically arrive by their early to mid 40s, long before retirement. Long before most people are told to expect anything meaningful to have kicked in. Here's what makes this number different from every other financial milestone we've talked about in this series. It's not really about how much money you have. Two people can have very different account balances and still be at completely different distances from this crossover point, depending entirely on the shape of their contribution history and how long their money has actually had to compound. It's less about the size of the number and more about the age of the money. So if this moment is this important, why isn't it part of the standard financial conversation the way net worth milestones or salary benchmarks are? I think there are a few honest reasons, and none of them are particularly satisfying. The first is that it's genuinely hard to communicate simply. The dollar amount your portfolio grows by in a year exceeds your annual contributions doesn't fit cleanly into a headline the way "you're a millionaire" does. It requires understanding two moving numbers relative to each other, not just one big number you can point to. Financial media, understandably, gravitates towards simpler, punchier milestones. The second reason is a little more uncomfortable, honestly. The traditional financial industry, the parts of it built around ongoing advisory fees, around managing your investments year after year, doesn't have a strong incentive to highlight the moment where your portfolio effectively starts running itself. There's more of a natural pull toward messaging that keeps the process feeling complicated, ongoing, something you need continuous guidance for, rather than something with a clear internal turning point worth understanding on its own. And the third reason is just that it's an unusually personal number. It depends heavily on your specific contribution history, your specific asset allocation, market conditions during your specific investing years. There's no single, here's when it happens for everyone answer, which makes it harder to package into a universal piece of content the way save 20% of your income can be. But here's why I think it matters more than almost anything else we've covered in this whole series. Once you understand this crossover exists and roughly where you are relative to it, something shifts in how saving actually feels. Before the crossover, every dollar you put in genuinely is the primary driver of your progress. The sacrifice feels proportional to the result, which is exactly why saving in the early years can feel so slow and unrewarding. After the crossover, the math starts working with you in a way it simply wasn't before. Recognizing where that line sits, even roughly, changes the emotional weight of the whole process. Now here's the part that actually matters for what you do next, because this crossover point isn't fixed. Specific decisions pull it significantly earlier, and other decisions push it significantly later, sometimes by years, without most people ever noticing which direction they're moving. The first lever is contribution timing, not just contribution amount. A dollar invested at 28 has, all else equal, meaningfully more time to compound than a dollar invested at 38. This sounds obvious, but the practical implication surprises people. Front-loading contributions earlier in your investing life, even if it means smaller contributions later, tends to pull the crossover point closer than the reverse. Steadily increasing contributions while starting later. Time in the market is doing more of the actual work than most people give it credit for. The second lever is asset allocation, and this one is genuinely counterintuitive for a lot of people. A portfolio held mostly in cash or very conservative investments essentially freezes the compounding engine before it ever gets going because there's very little growth happening on top of the growth. This isn't a suggestion to take on reckless risk. It's simply naming the mechanical reality that the compounding crossover depends on your money actually being invested somewhere that grows, not just accumulated somewhere that sits. The third lever, and probably the most avoidable one, is interruption. Every time contributions pause, job loss, a spending priority shift, a decision to take a break from investing during a stressful year, the compounding curve doesn't just pause along with it. It resets some of its momentum because the growth that would have compounded on top of that missing contribution never happens. A 2-year pause early in an investing timeline can push the crossover point back by more than 2 years because of what those specific dollars would have gone on to generate if they'd stayed invested. The fourth lever is fees, quietly eating into the exact growth that's supposed to be doing the heavy lifting. A portfolio paying meaningfully higher fees than necessary isn't just losing a small percentage each year. It's losing compounding growth on that percentage every single year going forward, which specifically delays the point where growth outpaces contribution because a portion of that growth is being redirected away before it ever gets the chance to compound on itself. And the fifth lever, the one most people don't think of as a lever at all, is simply staying invested during downturns instead of pulling back. Some of the strongest single years of market growth in history have happened immediately after some of the worst ones. Stepping out during a downturn, even briefly, risks missing exactly the recovery growth that does an outsized amount of work in pulling the compounding crossover point closer. None of these 5 levers require dramatically more money. They require understanding that the crossover point is something you're actively moving in one direction or the other with every decision, whether you're paying attention to it or not. I want to spend a few minutes on what actually shifts, practically and emotionally, once someone crosses this point, because it's more significant than people expect. Practically, the math starts behaving differently in a way that becomes genuinely visible. A year where the market grows 8% might now represent more actual dollars of growth than an entire year of contributions did just a few years earlier. This isn't abstract. It shows up clearly on a statement, and for a lot of people, it's the first time investing starts to feel less like a monthly obligation and more like something with its own visible momentum. Emotionally, something shifts too, and it's worth naming honestly. There's a specific kind of relief that comes from realizing your effort and your outcome are no longer perfectly tied together. That even in a year where contributing felt hard, where life got in the way, the money already in motion kept doing its job regardless. That doesn't mean contributions stop mattering. They still matter enormously, especially in terms of protecting and accelerating the trajectory. But the psychological pressure of feeling like every dollar of progress depends entirely on this month's decision starts to ease, because a meaningful portion of the progress is now coming from momentum that was built in earlier years. There's also a subtle shift in how setbacks feel. A market downturn after the crossover point genuinely can feel less threatening than the identical downturn would have felt before it, specifically because there's a longer track record of recovery and compounding already underneath the current dip, giving a different kind of grounded confidence that a purely contribution-driven portfolio hasn't had time to build yet. None of this means the crossover point is a finish line. It's closer to a shift in gears. The vehicle is still moving forward because of the same underlying mechanics, but the relationship between your effort and the outcome has genuinely changed shape. Here's what I think matters most about this number, more than almost anything else we've covered in this series. It's not something anyone can hand you. There's no external authority that announces when you've crossed it. It's quiet, and it happens somewhere in the middle of an ordinary year, probably one you won't remember specifically, because nothing dramatic marks the day it happens. But understanding that it exists, that there's a specific point where your money's own growth starts outpacing your contributions, changes how the whole process feels, especially in the years before you get there. The sacrifice in the early years isn't permanent. It's not evidence that the system doesn't work. It's exactly what building toward this crossover point actually looks like, before the math has had enough time to shift the balance. If you want a rough sense of where you personally stand, the calculation is simple enough to do yourself. Take your portfolio's approximate growth in dollars over the last 12 months and compare it to your total contributions over that same period. If growth is still smaller, you're not there yet, and that's completely normal. If growth is starting to close the gap or has already crossed over, you're closer to this shift than most financial content ever tells people to expect. Tell me in the comments, have you ever actually calculated this for your own accounts, or is this the first time you've thought about it this specifically? I read every comment, and I think this is genuinely one of the more overlooked numbers in personal finance, precisely because it doesn't fit neatly into a single dramatic milestone the way other numbers in this series have. If this series has been useful to you, understanding where your money goes, what happens at different net worth stages, and now the quiet point where your money starts working harder than you do, subscribe if you want to keep building this understanding with me. Until next time, take care of your money and pay attention to the quiet moment when it starts taking care of itself too.